Today, I'm doing a podcast episode with research professor Jennifer Lansford from Duke University, who specializes in child and family policy. So I hope you guys enjoy. Hello, everyone. I'm Ulysses, and today I am here with Professor Jennifer Lansford, a research professor at Sanford School of Public Policy and a faculty fellow of the Center of Child and Family Policy at Duke University. Nice to meet you today.
It's a pleasure to meet you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so actually before I ask these questions, I wanted to ask you because when I was researching you, I found out that you write your own textbook, and I'm curious, Ted, do you use your own textbook when teaching your classes?
It's a great question. I'm actually not teaching any classes right now that are introductory developmental psychology classes, which is mainly what the textbook would be used for. So no, I don't, but it's a real treat to write the textbooks.
Yeah. And the textbook you wrote is Child Development and Introduction, and I have some questions about that. So in your research, you've studied parenting practices across different cultural and socioeconomic backgrounds. So how has this global perspective on corporal punishment evolved in recent years?
I think it's been a, a slow starting process that's accelerated. So, um, scientific researchers originally focused mostly on effects of corporal punishment on children's development from a scientific standpoint. But in a global perspective, this has also increasingly taken on a human rights focus. So the United Nations back in 1989 started advocating for children's right to protection against all forms of violence, including corporal punishment. And with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which was the most widely ratified human rights treaty ever, ratified by all countries in the world except the United States, um, children's right to protection, including from corporal punishment, was part of that human rights treaty. So countries have been, um, many countries now, 67, have outlawed all forms of corporal punishment in part as a way to protect children from violence.
I see. And based on your research, what are some of like the long-term psychological and behavioral effects of school-based physical punishment?
Yeah, so there's been a lot more research on home-based physical punishment than school-based physical punishment. But physical punishment in general is related to more child behavior problems, including aggression, and more child psychological problems, including depression and anxiety, and worse social relationships. So more problems with um, parents and peers and teachers. So there's evidence for a lot of negative effects of corporal punishment on children's development.
Your book actually cites a meta-analysis of over 160,000 children, which found that corporal punishment is associated with the increased aggression, antisocial behavior, and depression, anxiety. And so, given the extensive evidence in studies, why do you think parents and teachers still justify the use of corporal punishment today?
I think sometimes parents and teachers don't know what else to do, and so they resort to using corporal punishment, especially if they experienced corporal punishment when they were children. So parents sometimes will say, well, my parents spanked me and I turned out fine. And if they don't have a different model of parenting without using corporal punishment, then they may still use corporal punishment themselves. I think, though, um, and parents don't like to think that their own parents did something that would have been harmful to them. And parents aren't trying to harm their children. But now we know better that there are other more effective ways of disciplining children other than using corporal punishment. And it's kind of like with other things that change historically over time. I'll give an example of how infants are placed to sleep. So it used to be that parents would place their infants on their stomachs to sleep, but then scientific research found that that led to a higher risk of sudden infant death syndrome. And so then pediatricians and others started advocating for placing infants to sleep on their back instead of on their stomach, which reduces the risk of sudden infant death syndrome. And it wasn't that parents in previous generations were trying to hurt their infants by putting them to sleep on their stomachs. It's that they didn't know better. And so, but once they knew that there was a safer way to place their infants to sleep, they changed basically within a generation. And I think of corporal punishment as being that same way, that parents in previous generations didn't know as much about the harms of corporal punishment. But now that the harms have been well documented scientifically, with education, parents and teachers too, can change to using more effective and less harmful ways of disciplining children.
Yeah, and also, I think that's great. You talk about these alternative discipline practices. Your book actually also cites Edward Hoffman on alternative strategies in disciplining children. And so, do you mind sharing those strategies and explaining why it's better than physical punishment?
Yeah, so alternative strategies that are effective tend to change a little bit with the child's development and age, depending on what they can understand cognitively. So for infants and very young children, like toddlers, oftentimes redirection is the best approach. So infants and toddlers don't understand what they're doing is wrong necessarily. And so if they're getting into something that they shouldn't be getting into, the best thing parents can do is just give them something different to do that's safe or that's, an acceptable thing to do. So distraction. As kids get older and they can understand more and reason better, then parents can um, alter their discipline strategies in that way. And the researchers talk about both proactive and reactive forms of discipline. So it's better, if possible, to be proactive and prevent misbehavior before it starts. So one way parents can do that is to explain in advance, especially if they're going into a new situation, explain to the child, this is what you can expect in this situation. This is what I expect you to do in terms of your behavior, so that kids understand more about just what's expected of them, and that can prevent some misbehavior. But kids inevitably do things that they shouldn't do. And so parents also need to be reactive and to respond if children misbehave. And so typically the form of discipline that researchers have found to be most effective is called by inductive reasoning by researchers. It's basically explaining to the child why what they did was wrong and talking to them about the consequences of that misbehavior for other people. So, how would you feel if your brother hit you, or
Yeah.
how would you feel if your friend wouldn't let you play, or kind of whatever the situation is, talking through the situation with the child to help them take another person's perspective. That helps children develop empathy and compassion, and help them see what the consequences of their behaviors are for other people. So that kind of reasoning with children is generally the recommended um, kind of nonviolent form of discipline. Parents also sometimes take away privileges. They can put children in timeouts or remove cell phone privileges or things like that. So those are other alternatives that don't require physical punishment.
I also have a question because you mentioned, like, for example, with younger kids, like toddlers and infants, a more like distraction method, like, distract them from what they're doing. And I do see like a lot of parents, like, for example, give your kids iPads or like iPhones in an early age. So that kind of brought me up is, like I know that I guess that, distracts them and could make them, better, or like, if they're like screaming at a restaurant, you see them like, okay, I'll just give them an iPad. But is there like a negative effect, I guess, from giving, these like the like kind of like distraction devices at an early age?
That's a great question. Yes, there is a negative effect of too much screen time, especially, at an early age, but really any age.
Yeah.
And so if parents are able to distract their infants and toddlers with something besides um, electronics, that's better. Um, and oftentimes that's a crutch that parents use, sometimes understandably, and I get that. But oftentimes, if parents are able to more actively engage with kids, start talking to the child or playing with the child, as opposed to just handing the child a device, that would be better for the child's development in terms of social cognitive development.
And getting back on, your your textbook and corporal punishment, there's an interesting study I read from your book by Cooper Schmidt and Coy from 1990, where they studied 112 boys over a period of time since fifth grade. And the best predictor of violence during the later ages of life was actually aggression towards peers in elementary school. So could corporal punishment, like at a really early age, be contributing to peer rejection by reinforcing these aggressive tendencies?
Yeah, I think that's a hypothesis that's been supported by some research. So kids who have experienced corporal punishment um, are more likely to be aggressive with their peers. And if kids are aggressive with their peers, they're more likely to be rejected by their peers. And then that leads to additional kind of spiraling problems going forward. And one thought is that when parents hit their kids using corporal punishment, that teaches kids that a way to respond to things they don't like is hitting. And so parents are modeling a, an aggressive way of behaving that if kids carry that over into their peer relationships is not a good way to respond to peers.
I see. And I also want to explore how different countries and cultures view corporal punishment. And you published like hundreds of research articles. So one of your research articles on corporal punishment, maternal warmth, and child adjustment, a longitudinal study in 8 countries. Your research in that article shows that in more authoritarian parenting cultures, like in Colombia, Jordan, Kenya, and Philippines, corporal punishment actually had weaker negative effects on child outcomes. So why do you think that this cultural normativeness of corporal punishment reduces its harmful effects in some cases?
I think there are a couple important points. One is that in none of the countries that we studied was corporal punishment beneficial. So even in countries where it was normative, it was corporal punishment was still related to more child aggression and anxiety. So it's not recommended even in those countries. But I think one of the reasons that corporal punishment might have a weaker relation with child anxiety and aggression in countries where it's more normative is that it carries less meaning for kids that their parents are being personally rejecting and hostile toward them. So if a child is in a cultural context where many other parents are using corporal punishment, kids may think, okay, this is just what parents do, as opposed to if a child is in a context where not very many people are using corporal punishment, they think, oh gosh, my parent must really dislike me because they're doing this thing that other parents aren't doing, and take that as more kind of personal rejection, contributing to more anxiety and aggression.
So I think you already like kind of answered up this follow-up question, but I was still going to ask it anyways. So does that mean so cultural acceptance can reduce psychological harm of physical punishment, or that just not true and it kind of simply normalizes the behavior in that culture and society?
I think that's a really good question and an important distinction because even if for an individual child may not react as negatively if they're experiencing corporal punishment in a culture that has a lot of corporal punishment. At a societal level, there's evidence that in entire societies that have higher rates of corporal punishment also have higher rates of other forms of violence. So it kind of seems that if corporal punishment is normative, many other forms of violence are also more normative. And so at a whole society level, there are higher rates of violence in lots of different areas of life.
I see. And your study found that American parents reported higher levels of spanking compared to parents in Italy and China. And I kind of find that ironic because, given that like kind of like the US, they often emphasize like independence and freedom, while, Chinese and Italian parents focus more on obedience. And from, me personally, because my parents are from Taiwan, they said like back in their day, they were spanked a lot by their teachers, but like currently right now, I believe that countries like in China and Taiwan are actually banned. So they don't allow it anymore. But how do these cultural values shape attitudes towards physical discipline?
I think that cultural values play an important role in parents and teachers' use of corporal punishment. Um, and um, so part of what I think is going on in the United States is that in the United States, there's a strong emphasis on parents' right to choose how to rear their children. And some other countries have not prioritized parents' rights as much as children's rights. So some other countries have prioritized children's right to protection against violence more than they've prioritized parents' rights to do whatever they want with their children. And so I think that is one thing that can account for this difference with more violence toward children in the United States. Um, and some, I think, countries have tried to deal with that issue in different ways. As I mentioned, 67 countries have outlawed all forms of corporal punishment, including by parents in the home. In the United States, not only do we allow corporal punishment of children in the home, but many states continue to allow corporal punishment of children in schools. And countries that ban corporal punishment in the home typically start by banning corporal punishment in schools. So there tends to be this, many countries have this kind of increasing emphasis on child protection in different contexts, but we're not quite there in the United States yet.
And despite strong evidence against corporal punishment, the study references the UNICEF data showing that 63% of Americans in 24 developing countries had used physical discipline on their children in the past month. What are the biggest barriers preventing countries from fully banning corporal punishment?
I think the biggest ban is, or the biggest barrier to banning corporal punishment is the perspective that that parents should be able to do what they want in rearing their children, and basically that's been taken to include that parents should be allowed to discipline their children in ways that they see fit. Um, so I think in the United States, where we're far from having any sort of ban, there are some jurisdictions that have what's called like no-hit zones that have become, especially in hospitals, sort of like no smoking areas were in the past, as a way of saying no hitting is allowed here. Adults are not allowed to hit other adults. Adults are not allowed to hit children. Children aren't allowed to hit other children. Children aren't allowed to hit adults. And so I think by having these no-hit zones, the idea is to sort of raise awareness about this weird thing that we have going on in the United States, where we already have laws that say adults can't hit other laws, or adults can't hit other adults. That would be considered assault. We don't let children hit other children if they get in trouble at school, if children hit other children. But we make this weird exception and say it's okay for adults to hit children in the case of corporal punishment. And so I think no-hit zones are meant to raise awareness about that issue and say that that's not okay either.
Yeah. And I want to talk a little bit more about disparities of corporal punishment, specifically in the United States. In your article, the ethnic differences in the link between physical discipline and later adolescent externalizing behaviors. Given that Black American students are disproportionately subjected to harsher school discipline, including corporal punishment in some states, how do you think school policies reinforce the racial disparities observed in your study?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of evidence that there are ethnic and racial disparities with especially Black students receiving more corporal punishment in school. Also, children with disabilities being corporally punished more in schools, and so this sets up these patterns where you do find these disparities that are kind of contributing to inequities in education environments for kids from different racial and ethnic groups and different ability groups.
hmm Yeah. And what are some like policies lawmakers can enact to reduce this disparity? Even if they do keep corporal punishment legal, like such as in the state of Texas, like what are some policies that we can enact so that, students aren't, for example, racially profiled, so that we can kind of reduce this like racism and disparity in corporal punishment in schools.
Yeah, I think the best thing to do is to ban corporal punishment in schools. That's the I think the clear recommendation based on the scientific evidence and the human rights perspective. Um, uh, so I don't So I'll just say that. I think that unless corporal punishment is banned, I, I, I don't see a good way of reducing those kind of disparities. So I think that I strongly advocate for banning corporal punishment in schools.
Mhm. And this is actually a like a question from my YouTube comment section. It says so the person asked because of the racial disparities in using corporal punishment, is it because Black American students act out more because for example like problems at home and a high single mother rate, or is it because of racism in schools?
Oh, that's a tough question, and a good question. I think that there is evidence that teachers, especially white teachers, sometimes misinterpret behavior of Black students who are, for whatever reasons, kind of behaving in a way that um, they maybe there's some really good qualitative research on this of kind of behaviors that Black students may be engaging in that white teachers are perceiving as problematic, but the Black students are not perceiving as problematic, and that Black teachers may not perceive as problematic. So I think that one of the trickiest situations is when you have white teachers disciplining Black students for behaviors um, that the Black students themselves and Black teachers would not perceive as being problematic. And so you can get some real disparities there.
I see. And the final question is, after studying, like the long-term effects of corporal punishment across, racial and cultural groups, what is the most critical message you want parents and educators and policymakers to take away from your research? And if there was, one fundamental shift that you'd like to see in how, us as a society and people, we discipline children, what would it be?
I would say that we need to protect children against all forms of violence, including corporal punishment. There are much better ways of disciplining children rather than hitting them. And there are these real power imbalances when you have large, strong, powerful adults hitting small, vulnerable children. It's harmful to children's physical well-being. It's harmful to children's psychological well-being. So we as a society need to stop hitting children and help parents and teachers um, learn other more effective and nonviolent ways of disciplining children.
I see. And thank you so much for joining us today. And for everyone out there watching, I'll see you guys next time.
Thanks so much for having me.